Martin Luther, to sort of give you some of the background, and just so that we're all on the same page, Martin Luther was born 1483. So that'll be our first date. Can you read that? Sorry. Luther is born. His father was named Hans. Hans was not a wealthy man, but not poor either. He certainly worked for a living. He didn't inherit a great deal of fortune. Hans was a miner and a smelter who would eventually sort of work his way up to being the manager of a mine. And so it was hard, difficult work, but he was able to make a living. So he wasn't poor. They weren't poverty-stricken, having to beg for food, but they weren't far off. They weren't rich either. They didn't have a life of ease and comfort. And so, given this sort of lower level to medium level of wealth, Luther's father, from the time Martin Luther was a young man, a young boy, his father sacrificed heavily to pay for Martin's schooling, so that Martin could advance himself. And the goal from that very first venture into school was that he's not going to follow in my footsteps, right? He didn't apprentice him, teach him how to be a miner, how to be a smelter. The idea is that from Martin's youth, he was going to go to school in order to do what? Do you know? To be a lawyer. Your options for schooling were fairly limited in the Middle Ages. Even at the end of the Middle Ages, after universities have kind of been around for a while, if you went to a university, you'd go to school first, and then you'd go to university. If you went to a university, it was to study specifically just three things. They really only offered three doctorates that you could earn. One was being a lawyer. One was medicine, so you could be a doctor. And the third is theology, so you could get a doctorate in theology. And so some suggest that one of the reasons that Hans sacrificed so much for Luther to become a lawyer is because this would give him a chance at a better life, a chance at more income, more stable income, not having to work so tirelessly, right, with so much effort, right, at mining and mine smelting and metallurgy and all those kinds of things. The idea is to maybe raise Luther up out of the sort of middling economy that he was in. However, I think it might be more in the fact that if you're a miner, if you own your own mine production, or if you're a manager of a mine, it could come in really handy to have a lawyer in the family. This isn't just going to be good for Luther and his future, Martin and his future. This is going to be good for everybody, right? This is going to raise that mine out of poverty. If he's able to make and broker larger deals, those are the kinds of things you need lawyers for, to be able to negotiate with larger firms and to make sure everything is in order, to make sure you're not getting taken advantage of, right? And so the idea of having a lawyer in the family would not only have benefited Martin, it would have benefited Hans and everyone else, which makes sense of why Hans is so frustrated when Luther takes a slightly different path, a very different path. But at 14, he starts attending a wealthy or an expensive school. And so we know that his father was sacrificing to send him there because he couldn't send him with enough to eat. He could send him with enough to attend the school, but at the age of 14, he attends this expensive, a respected school, but then in his off time, he had to basically beg for food in order to survive while away at this school. At 15, they went to a place that was slightly closer to some relatives, so the food front was taken care of. He found a little old lady who showed care for him and fed him at his school when he was 15. And in all of these struggles, he was able to be head of his class. He did very well in school, and able to move to Erfurt, where he attended university. In 1502, he gets his bachelor's. In 1505, he gets his master's. And he's well on his way to getting the doctorate. At the PhD level, the doctorate level, that's when you would sort of specify which of the branches you were going into. These were fairly general topics, general backgrounds, and then you'd get to decide, is it going to be medicine, right, law, or theology? And like we said, right, the law was what was planned out for him from the time he was a child, and it was in 1505, when preparing for this doctorate work, that Martin was caught in a thunderstorm. And it was a violent thunderstorm, right, as he's traveling back from his home. After visiting home, he's traveling back to Erfurt, where his school is. And out in the woods, the lightning is striking all around him. And he interprets this, as many in the medieval society would, that these natural events were caused by a supernatural God. That the lightning, that the thunder that he's experiencing is a divine act. It's a divine sign from a God who is judgmental, from a God who is full of wrath. And so as he is surviving these lightning strikes that are striking very near to him, as he's panicking over the judgment of God, not just a natural event he wants to survive, but a supernatural event that he wants to survive, he says a prayer, and he pleads for his life, saying, "Saint Anne, save me and I'll become a monk." You ever heard of Saint Anne before? Saint Anne would have been very popular in his household because she was the patron saint of miners. And so it's likely that he heard this saint being prayed to more than Jesus, right? More than God. If his father was a miner, that he would have heard Saint Anne as the patron saint of his family. And so he calls out to Saint Anne, "Save me, and I'll become a monk." That's in 1505. Now, when making such a vow is not all that impressive, maybe, right? He's fearful, he's terrified in the moment, he's emotional, right? We all perhaps and probably say things when we're emotional, when we're afraid, and there's all 1,000 ways you could sort of rationalize it once the event is over, right? Well, I didn't really mean it, or God or St. Anne will know that I didn't mean it, right? But he sticks to it, which is interesting. I mean, in the medieval world, they certainly had this concept that you can't really enter into a contract with somebody if it's under duress, right? If they're threatening your life, then whatever you sign, whatever you agree to, isn't really valid because it wasn't entered into sort of willingly. And yet here he is, right, fearing death, making this deal, saying to St. Anne, "Save me and I'll become a monk." And then he follows through with it, right? Once he's safe, once he's through the woods, he follows through with it. And at this point, even his family can kind of tell there's some kind of crisis that he's going through, that he is dealing and wrestling with a spiritual crisis. And so while they don't approve of him giving up on being a lawyer and going away to a monastery, because for a father, think what else that means. No grandkids, right? If you're joining a monastery, there's no more family line coming from Luther. It ends with him. It means no lawyer in the family that they have been spending gobs of money on, right? All their savings have been going to Luther being a lawyer. This is going to provide for their retirement and their old age, right? All that's going away with this vow on the street, or in the woods, right, on the road. And yet he sticks to it. He keeps his vow, and as a monk he joins the order of Augustinians. There were several different monastery types you could go into. The Augustinian order obviously was known for following some of the rules and the teachings of Augustine. And when you join a monastery, you get like a year of sort of probation to see if you're really committed, to see if you really want to do this before they fully welcome you into a monastery. And he quickly makes a reputation for himself that after a year, right, of working harder than all of his fellow peers, they let him in. And like we said, the family is seeing this. The historians will see he's dealing with a spiritual crisis. To give all this up, to give this future up, to join a monastery, there's something drastic pulling him there, more than just a thunderstorm, right? That may be the event that caused him his departure, but there's a lot going on in the life of this person to give up so much, to focus on this more spiritual side